that we use to track how the macroeconomy is doing. And the most important piece of data is gross domestic product. And so we're going to start there, and we're going to talk about why the economy tends to fluctuate, right? So why it goes up and down sometimes. So previously we've sort of looked in the last chapter about how individuals make decisions about savings and consumption. That's actually Unit 11, not Unit 12. And that's going to impact how prices are set and how firms decide whether or not to invest in new capital equipment. And so we're going to think about how households and firms respond when GDP is either growing or shrinking, and what we should use to measure whether the economy is healthy or not. So this chapter is going to focus on GDP. We're going to talk a little bit about unemployment and inflation, but we're going to come back to unemployment in the next chapter, and then inflation in the chapter after that. But we are going to do some definitions right now to think about both GDP and unemployment especially. So this is a measure of GDP in the United Kingdom going all the way back to 1875. And it's the same data on both graphs. The only difference is that on the left side we have a linear graph. So the distance between each axis is the same, 5,000 pounds. And on the right hand side we have the log. And so just keep in mind that when we see a straight line in a log graph, that means we have constant growth in terms of a percentage. And so you can see some interesting trends, right? We definitely see that the economy was growing from about 1875 until 1920, but then it really sped up after World War I and during the 1920s, and then after the Great Depression. But we see two big drops, right? We see a drop for World War I in the UK. We see a drop for the Great Depression. If we were looking at the United States, we would see a bigger drop for the Great Depression and not much of a drop for World War I since it was fought in Europe. So we can see those two approximate growth lines. And so what we want to talk about is the business cycle. So this process of growing and not growing. So when we talk about the business cycle, we're talking about times where the economy is growing and then times where the economy is shrinking. Sorry about that. And so we call a time of growth an expansion. Right, a time where the economy is doing well, GDP is growing, the unemployment rate is falling, as opposed to a recession when GDP is shrinking and the unemployment rate is going up. And it's not a smooth process. It's also really not a predictable process. Macroeconomists wasted a lot of time in the first part of the 20th century trying to predict when these recessions would come, often because a lot of it was related to agriculture back then. That's really not the case now. So in the case of the UK, we can see, periods of very high growth, periods of negative growth, and those periods of negative growth tend to be associated with higher unemployment rates. And so we're going to talk about that in just a minute at the end of this video. But there's definite relationship where when GDP is growing fast, the unemployment rate is falling, and when GDP is shrinking, the unemployment rate is going up. So first we want to think about some definitions for the labor market. So we start with the whole population, right? That's this gray box here. That's everybody. But not everybody is expected to work, and in fact, we expect people to stay in school until they're at least 16 in this country. And so that shrinks the population of working age down to this blue box. We can divide that up into people who want to work, what we call our labor force, and people who don't want to work. They're out of the labor force. Now, that could be for a number of reasons. They could be retired, they could be taking care of kids, they could be in college, or they could have given up looking for work. And that's going to be an important thing that we're going to talk about, because if they've given up looking for work, that might signal that the labor market is not working well. And then the labor force themselves is broken up into people who are employed and people who are unemployed. Now, when we say someone is unemployed, it means that they are able to work, they want to work and they're looking for work, but they can't find a job, or at least not one that's acceptable to them. And the labor force then is equal to the employed plus the unemployed. So a few key statistics here that we're going to talk about and keep coming back to in terms of what's going on. We'll look at some of the data in the United States in later videos. The participation rate is the fraction of people who want to work, right? So if we go back to our previous slide, the participation rate is the labor force, the purple box, divided by the blue box. And that can go up and down for either good reasons or bad reasons. If people are giving up looking for work, then it's going to go down for bad reasons. If people are retired, so the participation rate is the labor force, the purple box, divided by the population of working age, or the blue box. The unemployment rate is the amount of people who want to work but can't find a job, right? So it's the fraction of the labor force that is unemployed. So it's equal to the unemployed divided by the labor force, which is just the unemployed divided by the employed plus the unemployed. If we go back to our box, that's the yellowy orange box divided by the purple box, right? And that's definitely a bad sign for an economy when the unemployment rate is high, because that means that there are a lot of people who want to work, who are willing to work, who are looking for work, but can't find a job. Finally, the inverse of the unemployment rate is the employment rate, and that's just equal to the employed divided by the population of working age. And if that goes up, that means that more people are working. If it goes down, it means less people are working. And it's possible, for both the unemployment and employment to be low if people have sort of given up looking for work, right? If they aren't able to find jobs. Finally, the last thing we want to talk about in this video is the idea of Odens Law. And so Odens Law is all about the relationship between GDP and the unemployment rate. And basically what we have in these little graphs is the change in the unemployment rate on the vertical axis and real GDP growth on the horizontal axis. And so what we can see is that when the real GDP growth is higher, the unemployment rate is falling. That said, there's different relationships for different countries, right? If we look at Japan here in the middle left, we can see that their relationship is pretty flat. And so there's not a whole lot of relationship between the unemployment rate and real GDP growth. On the other hand, for the US, we see a steeper line, which is more similar to Spain or Germany, but they have a lot more noise in their numbers, right? The points are not as close to the line. And so that shows us that not only is GDP growth important for the unemployment rate, but that there's a lot of other things that are important for the unemployment rate as well. And if that's the case, then we want to think about things like institutions, think about the relationship between the employer and the employed, and so that's going to be important. So we can talk about Odens coefficient, right, which is the degree of correlation between real GDP growth and the unemployment rate. But there is definitely a general trend that when GDP growth is high, the unemployment rate is falling, and when real GDP growth is low or negative, the unemployment rate tends to go up.